Capital is an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker, but the living flesh it converts into dead labour is ours, and the zombies it makes are us.
Well, hello there. You are just in time for your first shift in this Jungle fulfillment facility, where today we will be reviewing The Last Worker, both as a game and as a piece of political media. The Last Worker, for those who haven't read your Jungle induction guides, is a satirical first-person puzzle and stealth narrative game set in a dystopian future. You will play as Kurt, the last human worker in a huge fulfillment centre, surrounded by robots, automated machinery, and the ominous recordings of the company's CEO, Joseph Jungle, which play out on huge screens overlooking the facility. The Last Worker is a game which is explicitly trying to present itself as a commentary on some of the challenges facing modern society, as per the blurb on the publisher's website.
Nothing can stop progress. The Last Worker is a first-person narrative adventure centred around our struggle in an increasingly automated world. Combining a handcrafted art style with uniquely immersive gameplay mechanics in an epic setting, The Last Worker delivers an emotional, thought-provoking and comedic story packaged with rich characters performed by an all-star cast.
Let us make no mistake, the political element of this game is declared loud and clear, and the aspiration is to reckon with our struggle against automation and its impact on ordinary people. So, as we go into your first shift here at Jungle, let's take a look at The Last Worker and decide whether it is a fun game to play, and perhaps more importantly, whether it is a functional critique of late-stage capitalism.
Work and life become inseparable. Capital follows you when you dream. Time ceases to be linear, becomes chaotic, broken down into punctiform divisions. As production and distribution are restructured, so are nervous systems.
In The Last Worker, you play as Kurt, a middle-aged company man, long-term employee, and, as I imagine you've already gathered, the last human worker remaining in a huge fulfillment centre run by the corporation known as Jungle, a sort of fictional proxy of, yes, Amazon. Jungle, jungle, Amazon, satire. Jungle is run by Joseph Jungle, a billionaire and figurehead whose appearance does admittedly bear some resemblance to a certain other bald billionaire psychopath, albeit this time with a rainbow wig. Like Amazon, Jungle appears to sell virtually anything you can imagine, and Joseph largely appears in the game via huge screens within the facility to encourage, cajole, and threaten their staff.
Howdy.
You've been randomly selected for a Jungle race. I care deeply about each and every Jungle employee. But we have reached critical mass and have to make tough choices.
Critical mass. I'm literally the last one here.
3 laps, 3 products. The first to dispatch all 3 wins, the other loses their job. Congratulations, Explorer. You've won the best prize there is. You get to keep your job. Now dance. Now dance.
We learn that at one point there were a great many human employees in the facility, but over time they have been discarded and replaced with an automated army of robotic guides, pickers, and security guards. However, the human-centric infrastructure remains in place, along with the hollow platitudes and motivational messages of Joseph Jungle echoing off the vast walls of the warehouse as you move around on your little hover trolley, trying to pick and deliver enough boxes to avoid drawing the ire of the company.
Okay, where's my product?
Be the kitten that gets the milk.
Come on.
Be the sperm that gets the egg.
What? Where's my...
Fetch the product if you want the job.
This is just a simulation, right? Right?
We get little hints about Kurt's past via the intro sequence, which incidentally felt very reminiscent of the Severance TV show intro. If you haven't seen it, you definitely should. Going back to the intro sequence, we see the fulfillment centre peaking at around 13,000 explorers on site, according to the screen in the background, before machines start to replace the human workers, who are falling behind the ever-rising minimum standards. We see Kurt meet another worker called Rosa, fall in love, and we see Rosa, then clearly pregnant, deciding to leave Jungle, and Kurt choosing to stay behind. Kurt instead is shown working there up to the point we meet them in the game, as a middle-aged man, and with a picture of themselves and Rosa hanging from their hover trolley as a reminder of the last real human connection that they have ever had. We also discover Kurt is living in a forgotten disposal room within the fulfillment centre, and doesn't even leave the facility after work, living as a sort of on-site vagrant.
I can't believe you live here.
I like to think of it as working from home.
This naturally raises questions as to whether the pay is enough for them to have a home of their own, and why they would even persevere with this job if its rewards are so poor and it has cost them so much in their personal life. But I don't think we ever really get to the bottom of why Kurt decided to stay all that time. Looking at the chosen style of the game, the art style is cartoonish with a sort of cel-shaded look, and a preference for stylistic flourishes and bold colour choices, as opposed to perhaps a more grim, dark or realistic depiction of what is, after all, a very dystopian environment. This provides the game with both a distinct visual identity and a playing environment that allows for easy navigation, using colour coding in conjunction with the in-game signposting you would expect in a fulfillment centre. The gameplay is fully three-dimensional, with your hover trolley being capable of moving up and down the y-axis, and this verticality plays a big part of the game in the early stages as you zip around the huge facility, identifying the boxes you need, assessing whether the package matches its declared size and weight, and judging whether it has been damaged.
Don't worry, I'll take it from here. Ooh, it's vibrating and displaying the target weight and size. Is that right, Skew? That's right, and I gotta make sure it matches the info on our dashboard. And, sure enough, it does. So, we're good, right? We're not? The product's damaged. Just
Such freedom of movement really helps you appreciate the vastness of the facility, and adds to the feeling of isolation and of being a very small cog in a very large machine. And perhaps that is the point. As old Marx said himself, by the time you get to the highest stage of capitalism, human functions can be more dehumanized than that of a tool. You become the appendage of a machine, just part of a tool, a cog in the vast machine of production. Going back to the day job, any deviation from the declared characteristics of the box you were seeking, or any flaws in its condition, lead to it needing to be recycled. And this is perhaps a little nod to the very black and white, quantitative view of such a mechanised environment, where deviation from the norm is viewed as being undesirable and punishable by rejection. Indeed, the intro sequence shows this same approach being used to remove workers that fail to meet the impossible standards of Jungle. If the box does match the labelled expectations and is in decent nick, you fire it into the Futurama-like delivery tubes and are given a little celebratory summary of what is contained inside, which is often a joke product or a reference to another piece of popular media. This then gives your current shift rating a small boost, though it inevitably begins falling again almost immediately, as they encourage you to push your limits to achieve the highest possible rating and to avoid falling into the lower end, where there will be consequences.
You're fired.
Your shift rating is basically the way that Jungle rates your performance, using a school-like grading system which ranges from J.
At Jungle, the J comes before the A.
Oh yeah.
Which supplants A as the optimal grade, to F, with an F resulting in your sacking and the game ending prematurely.
You're fired.
All of this is happening during a set amount of time too. Shift. meaning that you receive your shift rating when the clock hits 0. This is a very real nod to the working conditions at places like Amazon, where automated picking technology feeds data into employee earpieces about the speed they're working and the expectations they need to hit, with any performances falling below target publicly called out, shamed, and eventually used as a means for sacking workers that can't meet the deliberately stretching goals. The phenomena of workers having to pee in bottles to avoid falling behind pick rates is sadly well known, and is an excellent example of how big companies can control behaviour and exploit workers using cynical working practices.
There's no time for bathroom breaks because you don't want to get written up for, being off the clock. It's called time off task at Amazon. There's evidence that people are, pissing in bottles or holding it in to the point where women at Amazon often complain about developing urinary tract infections. It's really bad and well documented most among the delivery workforce.
But an Amazon spokesperson said that they don't do that.
Yeah, well.
An employer can't legally ban you from using the toilet, but they can create an environment where the toilets are far enough away from where you are working that using them becomes a huge disadvantage to your recorded work performance, effectively forcing workers to choose between hitting targets or the most basic human amenities. When those targets determine your take-home pay, opportunities for more shifts and possible progression, not to mention your employment in general, it is not a fair choice now, is it? With Rosa having left, along with every other human worker, the only social interaction that Kurt typically has in their life is with a small floating drone called Skew, voiced by Jason Isaacs, who adopts a strong Scouse accent and uses a delivery that almost hides the fact it is Jason Isaacs, which is a choice, especially given that this voice was available the whole time.
I'm in. I fucking thinks he can take on the Red Army. I fuck Germany. I think I can take a flesh lump in a fucking waistcoat.
Skew does have a lot of personality, however, and provides a bit of humorous conversation for Kurt, acting as their confidant and their only work colleague, and so there is a familiarity and comfort between them which proves quite important, given that all the other drones pay Kurt no mind at all, just getting on with their tasks. Now, we aren't going to go any further into the plot right now. We will touch on some key points as we move through the video, but instead, let's talk about the game itself. Is it any good? I am pleased to say that it is a largely enjoyable experience mechanically. The fulfillment center gameplay loop of assessing and delivering boxes is simple but quite satisfying. The addition of subversive tasks further into the game offers some much needed variety, especially since they are often expected to be completed whilst also maintaining an acceptable level of service on the day job, which is a fun challenge. As the game progresses, additional abilities are unlocked, layering complexity each time the previous game loop becomes stale. And stealth starts to become a more regular feature of the gameplay as you try to avoid detection in the forbidden sections of the facility. Now, I know that enjoyment of stealth mechanics is very much dependent on your personal tastes, but they feel reasonably well designed in most instances, and the game makes it pretty clear what you need to do to beat them. It also helps that it feels a fairly natural addition to the game, as opposed to a sort of tacked on mechanic designed to flesh out a game.
Please understand, Max. The only place Max! Only.
There is some very basic and limited combat in the late game, but thankfully you're encouraged to think and problem solve rather than brute force your way through the game. There is an almost immediate restriction on the use of your only weapon, which stops the game becoming just another janky first-person shooter and keeps the player viewing confrontation as a puzzle to be solved rather than a mere opponent to be destroyed. You are, after all, a middle-aged man in a glorified mobility scooter.
Jesus Christ, that's Jason Bourne.
Towards the end of the game, there is some story branching, which allows you to pick one of 3 possible endings, but we will cover those in more detail later in the video, as, frankly, this is where the game starts to drop off for me. The whole game was probably around 4 to 5 hours long to explore all of the endings, so this is a pretty good length for this sort of game in my experience, especially since I'm about 400 in gamer years and I don't have as much gaming time as I used to. I don't need collect the 400 feathers Ubisoft style filler Thank you very much. It was also wise to keep it brief, given the relatively simple gameplay loops and mechanics, so that just as you were starting to tire of it, it introduces a new element or an extra layer of complexity and keeps the narrative moving along. As an overall review, I'd probably put this as a 6.5 out of 10. That probably sounds a little harsh, but that's a decent enough score, I think. It's not got much replayability. The main enjoyment comes from the narrative as opposed to the gameplay, and it doesn't do much mechanically that you haven't seen elsewhere. The visual elements and style choices are fun and the voice work is great, but it doesn't elevate the game above decent for me personally. Its biggest drawback was the ending choices and the confused politics of the narrative that start out as puzzling and finish as pretty darn hollow. What do I mean by that? I'm so glad you ask.
Time after time, the villain in Hollywood films will turn out to be the evil corporation. Far from undermining capitalist realism, this gestural anti-capitalism actually reinforces it. Take Disney or Pixar's WALL-E, published in 2008. The film shows an Earth so despoiled that human beings are no longer capable of inhabiting it. We're left in no doubt that consumer capitalism and corporations, or rather one megacorporation, by and large, is responsible for this depredation. A film like WALL-E exemplifies what Robert Fowler has called interpassivity. The film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity.
When you decide to make a game that positions capitalism, and more specifically Amazon's model of business, as the evil of your setting, I think it's important that you have a strong idea of what exactly it is that makes it evil, and position your solutions in opposition to this. For an effective critique, it's not really enough to simply point at something and say, "This is bad." In my opinion, you need to demonstrate what makes it bad, and in doing so create a meaningful path to a solution. The mundane evils of capitalism, worker exploitation, and corporate indifference do not afford you the immediate and obvious imagery of an evil dictator, a demon, or some physical disaster, even though they can absolutely be portrayed this way. So you need to paint a picture explaining why they are demons or dictators. Popular media, education, and common sentiment in the West all reflect the permissible consensus allowed by liberal democracy. That being, the institutions of government are largely correct and good, capitalism is imperfect but the best option, and inequality is distasteful but largely an inevitable part of life. This is famously captured by Francis Fukuyama's 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, where Fukuyama speculated that the end of the Cold War signalled also the end of ideological conflict, since Western liberal democracy had crushed both fascism and communism. And yet, suffering continues. Climate change threatens all of human existence, and as a world, we continue to operate under a system that is increasing inequality at the same time it tells us that we simply must have the latest gizmo or gadget. Despite all this, Western liberal politics is unable to criticise systems and traditions that it relies upon for its own continuation, and so it creates for itself the bad apple defence. Ah yes, but if we had good people in charge, things would be better. That's why Starmer's Labour is better than the Tories, despite having near enough the same policies. Starmer is a better person? That's why you should have voted for Kamala Harris, despite them offering very little that voters wanted. Harris is a better person than Trump. That's why, when the police are shown to be institutionally racist, sexist, homophobic and corrupt, the institutional and media response is for reform, a change of leadership, an inquiry into who could have caused this. But in all these examples, there is never any real examination into how a country of 330 million people ended up with a geriatric basket case like Trump, or Biden before him, or how the 68 million people of the UK ended up electing a new Prime Minister in a landslide election, despite them being about as popular as gingivitis. When you are an integral part of a system, you want to see its survival, since any interrogation of its foundations might find cracks in yours. Now, the reason we're talking about all of this in a video game review is because of the way that The Last Worker presents its endings to the game. There are essentially 3 competing end states, and we're going to talk about each of those in turn, starting with a change of leadership. Throughout the game, you are contacted by your daughter Cheyenne via a drone that they sneak into the facility in order to enlist your help with a revolutionary movement called Spear, who we will talk more about shortly. You begin taking some side missions to help assist with their attempts to undermine Jungle, who are responsible for a number of environmental and economic crimes, and though reluctant, you do follow through in a number of ways. After assisting Spear with their objectives, a year passes, and you are shown continuing to do your job, but the facility is clearly in decline, with malfunctioning tech and a real sense that there has been zero interest in repairing anything. And although business continues, there clearly isn't an active hand on the wheel anymore. Eventually, the ennui and isolation leads to a sense of rebellion in Kurt, and with a little cajoling,
"You're gonna get me fired. I need to get out of here. Out of the way."
Wake up, mate. Your job's finished. It's over. Finito.
My job's all I got left.
That's a load of shite. More. Don't you want to find out? Don't you want to smash it all up, all of this shit? And don't you want to get out of it?
You begin destroying parts of the facility in what amounts to a futile rage at the waste of a life spent making money for a huge corporation that has clearly forgotten you even exist. We've all been there. Piloting a huge mech, you begin destroying your way towards Joseph Youngle's office, encouraged along by the new leader of Spear, using your daughter's old drone, and assisted by a resurrected Skew. And it is as you make your final approach on the office that the game offers you a series of choices. Joseph appears on one of the few still functioning screens and addresses you by name, offering you the chance to become their successor and take over the running of the now decrepit and failing facility.
I know we never spoke, but that's because I never felt the need to micromanage. Because you're the best, Good. You're the best explorer I've ever had, and the only one that was worth keeping. True leadership material. The fact is, I'm not getting any younger. I will need a replacement. You should take my place here at the top.
Kurt is offered the chance to be the good guy, in charge of the system responsible for a number of crimes against humanity. And if you take this option, you are able to enter Joseph's office to find that Joseph is in fact dead, and has been for some time. The company has been on autopilot, with Joseph's corpse propped up in their office, and the many automated systems having been running in lieu of any leadership for what we guess has been at least a year, but possibly even longer.
Mr. Jungle? I mean, Joseph? It's so good to finally meet you. Such an honor. Thank you for your offer. I'd like to accept it. I'm ready to lead with you.
The game ends as you discover all this, but it doesn't show you what happens next. So what can we gather from this ending? Well, there is the commentary on the replacement of human workers by machines, as the very automation that replaces everyone at your level has seemingly also manifested at the very highest level. The facility has continued to run, orders continue to be fulfilled, and the many robots and systems have endured, albeit in a very tired state, without the need of a human intellect at the top. We could take that to also be a commentary on how little value CEOs and business minds actually have on the end product of a business. It is largely able to continue, unhindered, for at least a year before anyone realises that there's no longer any human beings involved in the day-to-day running of Jungle. But what of Joseph's offer of succession? Was that an AI version of them that was speaking to them from the screen, indicating that an artificial version was running the business for some time, and that ultimately a digital ghost was able to run a large-scale business just as effectively as a human being? Or a billionaire at any rate. Or are we to believe that Kurt, after years of so little human interaction and the relentless monotony and loneliness and following a rage-filled episode of recrimination, has become unhinged to such a point that they have hallucinated an option that allows the continuation of the only existence they've known for decades. Could Kurt be experiencing a level of institutionalization that necessitates a reality where it continues, rather than face life without the many routines and reassurances provided by an environment they were used to? In other words, like my earlier criticism of Western liberalism, could they be projecting their dissatisfaction onto a bad owner in order to preserve a bad system that they're used to? This ending is very much played as a negative ending regardless, with the screen fading away as you discover Joseph's skeletal presence, with the player left to ponder what might happen to Kurt, someone so conditioned by life in the fulfillment center that they may have just hallucinated an entire conversation in order to protect their fragile mental state. The game essentially suggests that Jungle has run its course and has collapsed under its own weight because so much power was situated under one person, who has died without a succession plan. Jungle was seemingly one person's vision, and it slowly begins to unravel with their removal, albeit able to continue for some time with its reliance on automated systems. A commentary on the end result of rampant capitalism, perhaps? On how endless growth is unsustainable? Perhaps, but probably not. So if this is a bad ending, what of the other options that we're able to take as we approach Joseph's office? Throughout the middle section of the game, we assist the revolutionary group Spear, or to use their full name, the Society Promoting an End to Automated Redundancy, with your daughter speaking to you via a drone that they have snuck into the facility.
I'm with Spear.
Spear.
The Society Promoting an End to Automated Redundancy.
That's quite the mouthful.
That's why we shortened it to Spear.
Wouldn't fuck robots have been more to the point?
I'll pass your comments on to management.
They lead you on a number of missions, mainly to find a missing leader of their movement named Emma, who had infiltrated the facility in an attempt to prove the crimes that were being committed in Jungle's name.
I really hope you get this. I hope you see this. I made it down to the belly of the beast. It's worse than I thought. Far worse. They're stalking death and destruction in family packs. Buy 2 world wars, get the 3rd one free. If all the Technicolor junk above doesn't finish us off first, they'll make damn sure that the stuff down here will. This is end-stage capitalism. It's the end of the road. I've seen hell. We are in hell. We must stop Jungle. We must fight fire with fire. Something's coming. I hope you get this. I hope you see this.
After discovering Emma's corpse in the forgotten bowels of the organisation, Kurt gains the ability to hack terminals using a tool found on their body, and discovers Emma's plans for taking down the fulfillment centre by destroying its very foundations using what is essentially a nuke. Working with your daughter, you later retrofit Skew with a nuclear warhead, allowing you to remotely pilot them into the core of the facility and detonate the warhead, thereby causing massive damage to the facility, though it doesn't seem to stop it entirely. Whilst working with your daughter, you learn that the new leadership of Spear is rather more problematic, and is being dominated by men that have lost sight of the true goal of the movement.
Are you sure this is a good idea?
Playing fetch is what I do.
We can't endanger the mission or they'll...
They who?
Spear.
Wait. Aren't they supposed to be the good guys?
Things have changed since Emma died. It's all men now. Power struggles, egos, politics. It's not the same.
Thus it is that towards the end of the game, it is not Cheyenne that approaches you in the drone, but a new Spear leader who is cajoling you into attacking Joseph's office. This new leader encourages you to rebel and destroy, but is regularly overheard talking to others in the background in what feels like a very blow-key and party-like atmosphere, suggesting that the intentions involved are perhaps not as focused on revolution as revenge.
We're impressed.
Who's we?
Oh, the whole organization. We're all watching you on the big screen. You're incredible. Right, guys? Raise a glass to Kurt. To Kurt!
Are you having a party?
No. This is our war room. Don't let us distract you.
Certainly, Kurt's well-being doesn't feel like a priority, and it is telling that Spear seems unwilling to risk direct involvement, instead coercing Kurt and asking them to take on all of the risk and responsibility, whilst they watch and cheer on in the background. Now, it is important to note that Kurt is largely manipulated throughout the whole game. Firstly, by Jungle and its many systemic controls and measures. Secondly, by their daughter, with a mixture of emotional influence and blackmail. And finally, by Spear and their calls to act for a larger cause and their encouragement of your more destructive instincts. Kurt is very much a pawn in several larger schemes that play out, and this can perhaps be seen as an attempt to portray how the humble worker is forced to fulfill the wishes of a number of competing forces, with them torn between a political movement, their employer, and their family. Spear are portrayed not as being good guys, but instead as just being another competing influence, one that acts as an equal counterpoint to Jungle in a framing that's kind of adjacent to horseshoe theory. Essentially, the demands coming from Spear are treated as not being unlike those coming from Jungle. It feels very much like a criticism of unions, with the worker being caught in between the two poles of union and employer.
Wait, aren't they supposed to be the good guys?
Things have changed since Emma died. It's all men now. Power struggles, egos, politics.
For a game to criticise late-stage capitalism and the corporate indifference to life and environment in favour of profit, it seems curious to then position unions and activists as just a different antagonistic force to the worker. And I must confess, it took me quite by surprise. We learn around the midpoint of the game that Jungle has a cure, or at very least a very effective treatment for cancer, but that they sell it at a price that makes it only available for the very rich.
Even the smallest treatments are reserved for the highest bidder. And Jungle Care has the monopoly.
This indicates that the profit motive is restricting access to advanced medical care, which is a pretty clear criticism of predatory capitalism, and acts as confirmation that society has stratified to an even greater degree. If you do pick the option to follow through with the revolutionary path, which means declining both Joseph's offer of promotion and Skew's offer to take you to your family, you enter Joseph's office and they are very much not dead, but alive and well. The drone from Spear joins you in a brief conversation with Joseph, before it explodes and kills you both, fully embracing the narrative that to Spear, the avatar for unionisation and political activism, you are as much a disposable pawn as you were to Jungle.
I'm just gonna get this done, but then you'll leave me alone. Me and my family, is that understood?
Oh, absolutely. You've got our word.
Why don't we have a chat, you and I, and see if we can figure things out between us. You and your
humor.
Do you have a family?
Thank you. My plan is to see them after I,
All right, guys, we've seen enough. Let's go.
This is our end, my friend.
Motherfucker!
The game ends after the explosion, and though you can probably reason that this ending would at least mean the end of Jungle, the facility, the organisation repeatedly shown to be destroying the world and responsible for the misery of millions, you do not get to see any of this. The game simply ends. It does not feel like a good ending, and in fact feels very similar in tone to the Jungle ending. So what is the game saying here? That revolution is just another way that people can be exploited? That unions are just another power base only interested in their own agendas? It feels a curiously confused position from a game that is critical of corporate employers and profit-driven access to medical care, but it reinforces my feelings that the developers have approached the issue from a sort of liberal or mistakenly apolitical viewpoint. Given that Spear are derailed by bad leadership, as is Jungle, and that perhaps if Emma, the good original leader, had remained in place, things would have been better with Spear. It feels like liberalism once again fails to understand the systemic nature of Jungle's threat, and that a wider dismantling of exploitative capitalism is the only way to address the very things they have identified as problematic, that being worker exploitation, withholding of key resources, and the destruction of the wider world via climate change caused by excessive consumption and the pursuit of profit and infinite growth. So, if the continuation of Jungle is bad, and the union or revolutionary path is also played as bad, what is the final pathway? Well, so a subplot throughout the game regards Kurt's ex-wife, Rosa, and their daughter, Cheyenne. Cheyenne eventually reveals that Rosa is alive but has cancer, and that they will die if they do not receive treatment, which, as previously mentioned, is unaffordable for ordinary people. Kurt, who has had no contact with anyone outside of Jungle for decades, is initially excited to hear of his former love and to learn of their daughter, and decides that they can use their unique position as the only human in the company to effectively steal a cancer treatment.
What medicine does your mom need? What's gonna save her? Because I'm gonna go get it.
Dad, we can't. That's not part of the mission.
The mission can wait. But I've wasted enough time as is.
You successfully do this. Rosa recovers, and Cheyenne continues to work with you to try and put the now deceased Spear leader Emma's plan into place, and to use a warhead placed in Skew to destroy the foundations of the facility. After you succeed in doing so, the facility declines but continues to operate at a reduced level, as discussed in the previous section, and a year passes with no new contact. And it is assumed Cheyenne either leaves or is ejected from Spear due to their views on the new leadership.
Things have changed since Emma died. It's all men now. Power struggles, egos, politics. It's not the same.
The lack of contact weighs heavy on Kurt's mind, and their grip on sanity clearly slips in the following year, leading to their willingness to go on a rampage using an old industrial crusher mech, leading to the choice outside Joseph's office. As you approach the office after making one of the initial choices to either succeed Joseph or fulfill the revolutionary path, Skew appears and offers another path.
Don't be scared, mate. It's me.
Skew?
I'll explain later. Grab my hand. Quick, get the fuck out of here.
If you accept Skew's offer, you are taken to a leafy scene outside of an American-style home, and Cheyenne and Rosa come out to meet you. No words are exchanged, and the fate of the Jungle facility is left unknown. It feels like a good ending in tone, and yet there is very little resolution beyond the potential for a family reunion, even as we question what Kurt's mental state is at this point and whether reconciliation is a reasonable expectation after everything that has happened. The final choice is one of removal from the facility, which might mean that Spear is still able to assassinate Joseph Jungle and bring down the company. But we don't know either way, and ultimately our choice is one of abdication of responsibility. It seems a remarkably passive way to end a game that critiques the Amazon model, the treatment of workers, and the existence of predatory capitalism, unemployment, and the withholding of medical treatment from ordinary people. Given what we know of both the predominant economic system,
Health has become a thing for the super rich, and the super rich only. Even the smallest treatments are reserved for the highest bidder.
and the state of the world,
Please, hear me out. The planet, humans, society, democracy, it's all slowly dying out here, Kurt.
it seems unlikely that Jungle is the only infrastructure underpinning this way of life, and the lack of a popular or systemic alternative, it just feels a bit futile. Yes, Kurt is with their family. Great. But now what?
It's all slowly dying out here, Kurt.
It all feels rather flat, ultimately. your agency is largely reduced to removing yourself from the problem and forfeiting your part in the conflict, which is, well, it's hardly inspirational, is it?
So long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we are free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange.
I was excited to play a game that seemed to be aimed squarely at critiquing the Amazon model, a model that exists at the sharp end of 21st century capitalism. A model that chews up and spits out workers with all of the care of a puppy chewing its way through your favourite shoes, while simultaneously sustaining a capitalism that is consuming our world's natural resources, pumping emissions into the atmosphere, and creating greater and greater financial inequality with a wild disregard for anything but the bottom line. And the game starts promisingly, creating a scenario where automation and the cold corporate pursuit of profit have led to mass unemployment, horrendous working conditions, and a devastated environment, all whilst preaching values of family, tolerance, and progressive philosophy. These are all valid criticisms of a modern capitalism, which dresses in the clothes of the LGBTQ+ rainbow when it suits, that talks of work-life balance and net zero targets, all whilst funding fascism, lobbying against climate change legislation, and funneling money to offshore accounts to avoid paying for the very infrastructures it relies on to function. However, the longer that you play the game, the more you start to realise that the story is drifting away from that critique. That all the criticism and pearl clutching of the early game was little more than virtue signalling. To swerve away from a Mark Fisher quote just this once, here is a Rory Blank comic strip that makes the point in a rather different way. Hey, is that an anthropomorphic hot dog wearing sunglasses and smoking?
He's such a bad boy.
His absurd nature reflects the chaos of our world.
He's like some sort of avatar that reflects how I feel.
Any sort of radical movement or aesthetic will in time become commodified, the act of rebellion itself constantly at risk of being made into a product. Whatever. Was the anti-capitalist messaging of the game really just a token effort to display a rebellion that was restricted to its presentation? The tepid selection of endings then puts a final nail in the coffin when it suggests that the happiest ending is to abdicate all responsibility, to step away from the big question of what is to be done, to instead frame the activists working against Jungle as if they were equally as exploitative, as if there is no difference in outcome. The Last Worker does criticise the working practices of Jungle, and it does call out the impacts of rampant capitalism, but it then seems to shrug and say, someone should do something about that, before getting in a cab and calling it a day. During this video, I have been quoting heavily from Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, as Fisher had a lot to say about how capitalism is able to absorb criticism and nullify its impact, and I want to use another one here.
Instead of saying that everyone is responsible for climate change, we all have to do our bit, it would be better to say that no one is, and that's the very problem.
If not now, when? If not us, then who? For me, The Last Worker simply doesn't work beyond its face value. It ends up a slightly hollow experience, which is a shame, as there is some solid writing and performances, some fun sequences, and some thought-provoking moments throughout the game. Ultimately, however, all the funny Jason Isaac lines can't save the fact that at the climax of the game, it offers 3 deeply underwhelming options and leaves us with a feeling of emptiness and irrelevance, and a narrative that reduced Kurt's agency to a footnote in their own story. I suppose it's fair to ask if video games are the right medium for criticism of overarching economic systems, given that as an industry it's so firmly entrenched within those systems. Whether we are talking about Valve, Microsoft, Sony or Nintendo, we are talking about huge and influential companies subject to the same priorities, motives and failings as those that are often criticised in games like Hardspace Shipbreaker, Citizen Sleeper and Disco Elysium, or in any other number of games where the profit motive and corporate greed are the baddies. Like Mark Fisher said, Far from undermining capitalist realism, this gestural anti-capitalism actually reinforces it. And this is what is at the forefront of my mind as I play these kinds of games. However, does this mean that there is no value in having video games that critique capitalism? I hope not. I think games that encourage people to think about power, wealth and influence are still worthy of our time. And any game that reveals the class-based nature of capitalist society and illustrates how the few that benefit most from a capitalist structure are able to manipulate those beneath in order to maintain that structure has value. Games that examine the relationships between power, politics and capital can help people to draw comparisons between the games they play and the rapidly escalating late-stage capitalism we see on our phones, our TVs and in our lives. As long as we appreciate that enjoying such media is not activism and will not change the world unless we actively apply its principles, I think that there is a place for video games that criticise capitalism, and little to be gained in dismissing them out of some sense of self-flagellation. Thank you for watching this video and for checking out The Last Worker. Please give it a like if you've enjoyed it and subscribe to see more of this kind of content. I feel kind of awkward criticising this game so heavily, as I imagine there was a lot of good intent behind it, and there is clearly knowledge of the picking environment common to companies like Amazon. But at the same time, if you were going to pitch me a game based on its political positioning or its analysis of late-stage capitalism, you'd better have the goods to back it up. I do not regret playing the game. It was a relatively small time investment, and I think the disappointment I felt with how it handled the endings is indicative of my relatively high regard for it up until that point. Thanks go out to Mrs. InsideLeft for their help with the script and lighting, to Nico for the continued use of their microphone, to those members of We Create Together that helped with the Mark Fisher quotes, and to Advent Song for the use of their music in the background of this video. Be kind, be supportive, and be good to each other. See you soon, comrades.